Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. A little bit late getting my installment out this week, but we, for the month of July, are reading this book, This Republic of Suffering by Drew Gilpin Faust, which is a study of certain aspects of the American Civil War. It's not a narrative history of the American Civil War. It's a meditation on some of the aspects of it. I went fairly easy this week in terms of charging ahead with this book. I hope you did too. Don't feel the need to do any number of pages per week. We have 5 weekends in July, and this is not a long book, so got plenty of time. But the note that I noticed most strongly in the sections, the pages that I read this time around, happened fairly early on. And it's a note about accountability in war, which I'm always happy when an author brings this up. Let me get to a quote here. It's an aspect that looks directly at something that we don't really think about now, because we have 100 years of precedence. We have 100 years of procedure in terms of identifying who's going off to war and where they are and whether or not they die. That system was non-existent or in its babyish infancy during the American Civil War. It really didn't gain any kind of a systematic approach until the First World War, and even then, when I was reading these parts of this book, I kept remembering incidents in World War I memoirs that I have read. People, just ordinary soldiers, just marching along. They include a mention in a letter back home that they were marching through a field of mud, and that the mud was sometimes very deep and very suctiony. It's dangerous, in other words, to walk across. You could easily get sucked down. And in one memoir that I read, a letter was quoted of a soldier who saw a cart horse, panic because it had lost its footing, started to thrash around in the mud, and an ordinary enlisted soldier broke ranks and hurried over from the lines to try to calm the horse. This boy was 18 years old, 19 years old, probably in his previous life. Maybe he'd had a knack with horses. Maybe he had them all around the family home and knew how to calm them. And according to the excerpt of this letter in the memoir that I read, horse and boy just disappeared. They thrashed their way into the mud and disappeared. No way to find them again until, the winter, or until a thaw in summertime or something like that. Just horrifying. Just horrifying. And it's very likely that in the First World War, no one will ever be able to know who that boy was. He will just be one of the many tens of thousands of young men who simply didn't return home. Their parents don't have any way to know one way or another anything more definite than that. Now we would view that as downright strange. The equivalent that I always think about in terms of this kind of accountability is the 9/11 attacks here in the United States. Because when the Twin Towers collapsed, you saw flyers and leaflets up all over Lower Manhattan, people saying, "This person is missing." They went to work at 7:30. They took the train every morning like they do, and they never came back. And there's nothing where their building was. Their workplace is not there anymore. I can't call and ask for the HR department. There are craters and piles of rubble where their building once was. And I'm seeing some dust and blood-covered survivors on the news. But my uncle, my husband, my grandfather, there's no word of him. And there never will be. And I remember in the early days of that, how utterly jarring that was. Not only for me, but for lots and lots of people. How utterly jarring it was. People thinking, well, people don't just disappear. People don't just disappear. Did he die there or did he not? He left the house this morning at 7:30. It's been 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I don't have any idea what happened to him. Did he die in that building? Was he out across the street at a vendor? Was he in a shop somewhere getting me something and he died there? Or that's the closest that you can get, I think, to the that visceral feeling of just not knowing. And Drew Gilpin Faust, in the sections that I concentrated on this time around, she gets at that. I want to read you a couple of passages here before I wrap up. This will not be a long video. There's one here where she really gets at it. It's such an elegant thinker. The dead of the Mexican War received no official attention until 1850, 2 years after the conflict ended, when the federal government found and reinterred 750 soldiers in an American cemetery in Mexico City. These bodies represented only about 6% of the soldiers who had died, and not one body was identified. But with the Civil War, private and public belief and behavior gradually shifted. This was a war of massed citizens' armies, not of professional regular forces. It was a war in which the obligation of the citizen to the nation was expressed as a willingness to risk life itself. In its assault upon chattel slavery, the conflict fundamentally redefined the relationship between the individual and the nation. This affirmation of the right to selfhood and identity reflected beliefs about human worth that bore other implications for the dead as well as the living. That is a wonderful way to put it. Fundamentally redefined the relationship between the individual and the nation. And she goes on, central to the changes that have occurred since the 1860s is the acknowledgement of the importance of information. That is sort of the heart of what she's doing with here. This book is mostly about transformations. It's mostly about grief and agony, and that's at the heart of it. That this is no longer a personal thing or just a national thing. They sort of merge with each other. You get that for common soldiers, ordinary people who wrote their memoirs, ordinary people who, like that boy a generation later, were only seen and not identified, so they didn't write anything. And you also get it for famous people. And Drew Gilpin Faust does a great job of shuttling you between those two extremes. Like, for instance, we have this picture of what those families were like in the 1860s, where, Richard went off to war and we haven't heard from him. We keep sending letters to the person he identified as his commander, but we're not getting any responses, and we've learned from the newspapers that the army isn't anywhere near where it once was the last time we got a letter from him. We don't know. We haven't heard from him. We don't know whether is he just too busy? Does he have a different commander? Is he dead? They don't know. And so they crowded the battlefields. They went there. They went to train stations and whatnot. We have this passage here. Desperate families, both north and south, traveled by the hundreds to battlefields in search of in person for missing kin. Observers described railroad junctions crowded with frantic relatives in pursuit of information about loved ones. When Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. rushed to Maryland, fearing his son dead after Antietam, he described the combination of hope and terror that must have been shared by many who traveled to the front in search of kin. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. was one of the most famous people in the country at the time. Public intellectual, I think, would be the term. When, in spite of his worst fears, he found the young captain alive, the father characterized his shifting expectations as, in some profound sense, a shifting reality. Quote, "Our son and brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found." And Drew Gilpin Faust goes on. The boundary between life and death seemed at once permeable and infinite. Of course, the son there is Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who would go on to become one of the most famous justices on the U.S. Supreme Court in its entire history, and who often remembered his ordeal as a very young man in the war. And that transformation that Drew Gilpin Faust is talking about is not only reflected in the sentiment of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr.'s letter, but also in the quotation there. She doesn't make any reference to it, but that, of course, is a quotation from the Gospels. That, of course, is a quotation from the parable of the prodigal son. With all that says, that she doesn't get into about the relationship between Wendell Holmes Sr. and Wendell Holmes Jr. I think it was probably just the first resonant quote that came to Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr.'s mind. But he was able to, he had more resources to go and do that than an ordinary farmer in Macon County, or in extreme West Connecticut, they wouldn't have had the ability to go crowd train stations down in D.C. or whatever. So that's the element that I concentrated on this time. I didn't do much reading this week, but we don't have a lot of book to cover, and we have a lot of ground to do it in. So I'm hoping to do a lot more for next week. So I'm gonna wrap this up early, but I'm hoping that you're all enjoying this as our nice leisurely July read. Next week sometime, or a little bit after that, I'll announce what August reading event is, what our next STE is. But in the meantime, I'm going to wrap this up. I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.